I'm going to tell you about the year my mom finally left my father, and how somehow, out of all that mess, she ended up with a man who actually knows how to love her. I'm 19 now, but most of this story happened when I was 16 and 17, and I've wanted to write it down for a while because I think there are a lot of kids out there living in houses like the one I grew up in, and I want them to know it can actually get better. My father was not a bad man in the eyes of anyone outside our house. He had a good job. He coached a kids' soccer team on weekends. He shook hands firmly and remembered people's birthdays and always tipped well at restaurants so the waiters would remember him fondly. Everyone thought he was a great guy. A pillar of the community, someone said at a barbecue once, and my mother just smiled and nodded because that was the role she'd learned to play a long time before I was born. Behind our front door, though, he ran that house like a country with exactly one law, and that law was whatever he decided it was in that particular moment. Dinner had to be on the table at 6:15, not 6:30, 6:15, because that's when he liked to eat. If it wasn't ready, he wouldn't yell. That wasn't really his style. He'd go quiet and cold and make some comment about how hard it apparently was to manage a household, and my mother would apologize for something that was barely her fault, usually because he'd come home 15 minutes early without telling her. He controlled the money completely. My mom had worked before I was born. She'd actually had a decent career, but he convinced her early on that with a child in the house, it made more sense for her to stay home. And once she did, he never let her forget that every single dollar in that house passed through his hands first. She had to ask for money for groceries. She had to show him receipts. If she bought herself something small, a new sweater, a haircut that cost a little more than usual, he'd bring it up for weeks, not as an argument, just these little comments, these tiny cuts. Must be nice to have money to spend on things like that, delivered with a smile so that if she got upset about it, she'd be the one who looked unreasonable. I want to be clear that he never hit either of us. I think that's part of why it took so long for anyone, including my mom and including me for a long time, to name what was actually happening. There's this idea that abuse has to look a certain way, has to leave marks you can point to, and because his didn't, we spent years telling ourselves that things weren't that bad, that he was just strict, just old-fashioned, just a perfectionist, just stressed from work. All the little words people use to explain away a father who makes the whole house hold its breath every time his car pulls into the driveway. Growing up, I learned to read him the way sailors read weather. I could tell from the sound of the front door whether it was going to be a calm night or one where we all needed to be very careful with our words. My mom got quieter every year I can remember. Not naturally quiet. She used to laugh a lot when I was really small. I have these fuzzy memories of her singing in the kitchen, but somewhere along the way that stopped, and she became this careful, watchful version of herself, always managing his moods, always one step ahead, trying to prevent whatever might set him off. The turning point, at least for me, was the night I turned 16. We'd had a small dinner, nothing fancy, and I mentioned just casually that I was thinking about applying for a part-time job at the bookstore near school, mostly because I wanted a little bit of my own money and my own schedule outside the house. My father put his fork down very slowly and asked why I would need money of my own when he provided everything I needed. I tried to explain it wasn't about need, it was about wanting some independence, wanting to save up for things myself. He looked at my mother like this was somehow her fault, like she'd planted some dangerous idea in my head about independence, and the rest of that dinner happened in total silence. Later that night, I heard them in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Their voices just carried through the walls, the way voices do in a house where everyone is used to listening carefully. He was telling her that she was raising me to be disrespectful, that a daughter who wanted her own money and her own schedule was a daughter who'd eventually think she didn't need a family at all. And my mother, very quietly, said something I'd honestly never heard her say before. She said maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I don't think he even really registered what she said. Or if he did, he brushed past it, because the conversation moved on to something else, but I registered it. I lay awake that night, turning that one sentence over and over in my head because it was the first time I'd ever heard even a flicker of rebellion in my mother's voice after years of her being the person in our house who absorbed everything and pushed back against nothing. After that, I started noticing small changes in her, so small I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. She started taking slightly longer walks in the evening, alone, which she'd never really done before. She started going to a weekly exercise class at the community center, paid for with cash she must have been quietly setting aside from the grocery budget. Small amounts, skimmed off over months. I didn't ask her about any of it directly because some instinct told me that if I made it a big deal, she might get scared and stop. It was at that community center, about 8 months later, that she met Daniel. I didn't know about him for a long time, not because she was hiding some affair, nothing like that ever happened, but because she genuinely wasn't looking for anything. She told me later she was just trying to have 30 minutes a week that belonged only to her. Daniel ran a small woodworking class in the same building, completely unrelated to her exercise group, and they kept running into each other in the hallway and the little coffee area outside, exchanging small talk that slowly, over weeks, turned into real conversation. My mom didn't tell me about him until things had already started shifting inside her. One afternoon, she picked me up from school instead of me taking the bus, which was unusual, and we sat in the parked car outside school for almost 40 minutes while she told me, carefully, like she was testing the words out loud for the first time, that she'd met someone who made her feel like a person again instead of a manager of somebody else's moods. She wasn't asking my permission exactly, but I think she needed to say it to someone before she could believe it herself. Daniel, from everything I learned about him over the following months, was about as different from my father as two men could be. He'd been divorced himself years earlier, had two grown kids he was close with, ran a small furniture repair business out of a workshop behind his house. He wasn't wealthy or particularly impressive on paper. What struck me once I finally met him properly was how small and steady he was in conversation. He asked questions and then actually waited for the answers instead of already thinking about his response. He remembered details my mom mentioned in passing weeks earlier. He complimented her cooking not as some grand performance, but just quietly, like it was simply true and worth saying. For months, my mom kept this part of her life almost entirely separate from our house, which in hindsight was probably the only way to survive what came next. She was building something quietly, a sense of herself outside of my father's control, a friendship that slowly became something more, all while still managing the daily performance of being his obedient wife inside those walls. I don't know how she held both of those realities at once without cracking, but she did, for almost a year. Everything came apart the following spring. My father found a receipt for a small gift, a bracelet, nothing extravagant, that Daniel had given her for her birthday, hidden in a coat pocket she thought was safe. He didn't explode the way you might expect. He got very calm, very cold, and told her that he already knew everything that he'd known for a while, which wasn't actually true. He was bluffing to see how she'd react, but it worked because she panicked and told him more than she needed to. That night was the worst I ever witnessed in that house. He didn't hit her. I want to say that clearly again, but the things he said were designed to be just as damaging in a different way. He told her no one else would ever want a woman like her, tired, used up, without money of her own, that she'd humiliate herself and me by leaving, that Daniel would disappear the moment things got difficult because men like that always did. He told her if she tried to leave, she'd leave with nothing, and she'd regret it for the rest of her life. I was 17 by then, old enough to understand exactly what was happening, and I remember standing in the hallway outside their bedroom door, absolutely terrified, not of him hitting anyone, but of what his words were doing, of watching my mother shrink in real time in front of me. And I remember thinking very clearly, if she doesn't leave now, she never will. And some part of me, God forgive me for how calculating this sounds, that same night quietly started looking up local resources for women in situations like ours, women's shelters, legal aid services for divorce, information I printed out at school on the library computer and hid in the bottom of my backpack. It took another 2 months after that night for her to actually leave, which felt like an eternity at the time, but which I now understand was actually incredibly fast, given everything she was up against. She met with a lawyer through a free consultation she found through one of those resources. She quietly opened her own bank account. She talked to Daniel honestly about what she was facing, and he told her, without any pressure, that he wasn't going anywhere, that he understood this had to happen on her timeline and not his, which apparently was the opposite of everything my father had ever told her to expect from him. The day she actually left, my father was at work. We packed 2 cars, mine and a friend's, with essentials, clothes, important documents, and left everything else behind because she said, and I remember this exactly, none of the furniture in that house ever felt like it was mine anyway. We stayed with her sister for about 6 weeks while the legal process moved forward, my father alternating between furious phone calls and occasionally attempts to sound reasonable, promising things would be different, that he'd change. The classic script I think every family in a situation like ours eventually hears. She didn't go back. The divorce took almost a year to finalize, and it was ugly in the way these things often are. Arguments about money, about the house, about custody arrangements, even though I was already mostly grown. But she didn't waver, not once, not even when he tried to convince mutual friends that she was the unstable one, that she'd left him for another man like some kind of scandal, conveniently leaving out the years that came before. Daniel never pushed his way into the middle of any of it. He helped when asked, drove her to a lawyer's appointment once when her car had trouble, but mostly he just waited, patiently letting her handle her own life on her own terms, which I think, more than anything else, is what eventually convinced her that what she'd found with him was real. It wasn't loud or dramatic love. It was steady in a way our house had never once been steady. They got married about a year and a half after the divorce was finalized, a small ceremony in his backyard, maybe 20 people total, nothing like the big showy wedding my parents had originally had, which I've seen pictures of, all that performance of a happy family that never actually existed behind closed doors. I stood up and said a few words at Daniel's wedding, and I remember looking at my mom's face during the ceremony and genuinely not recognizing the expression on it at first, because I realized I was looking at what pure, uncomplicated happiness looked like on her, something I don't think I'd ever actually seen before. My relationship with my father is basically non-existent now, by my own choice more than his. He still tells anyone who will listen that my mother destroyed our family for some other man, still can't seem to hold the idea that maybe he was the reason the family needed to be rebuilt somewhere else in the first place. I've made peace with the fact that he'll probably never see it any other way, because admitting it would mean admitting years of quiet cruelty he's convinced himself never happened. My mom is different now, 2 years into this new marriage, in ways that go beyond just being happier. She laughs easily again, the way she used to when I was really small. She has her own small part-time job at a garden center now, not because she needs the money, Daniel makes sure of that, but because she wants something that belongs entirely to her. She spends money on herself without flinching, without waiting to see if anyone will comment on it later. I think about that night when I was 16 a lot, the one where I heard her say through the wall, maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I don't think either of us knew, in that moment, how far that one sentence would eventually travel, through months of quiet planning, through one terrible night, through a year of legal battles, into a small backyard wedding with maybe 20 folding chairs, and a man who actually waits for her answers before he talks. If there's anything I want someone reading this to take away from it, it's that the absence of visible violence doesn't mean a house is safe, and that leaving something that looks fine from the outside is still allowed if it isn't fine on the inside. My mother spent almost 20 years believing she'd already used up her one chance at love, and she was wrong, and I get to watch her be wrong about that every single day now, which honestly might be my favorite thing I've ever witnessed in my entire life.